This week, we have heard so many heartbreaking stories from people who've lost everything to scams. Today, we're speaking to the banks. What are they doing to keep you safe? And are they failing Australians? If you had to explain to a child why you keep your money in a bank, what would you say? My guess is you'd start with the idea that it keeps your money safe.
That's a safe place to be.
Rather than under the mattress.
I think our money is safe with banks.
You'd conjure up images of fortress-like buildings with impregnable safes because it captures the bank's fundamental function. But quietly, digitally, it's precisely this function coming under attack. Because not only did Australians lose $2.7 billion to scams last year, increasingly, scammers are doing this by impersonating the banks themselves.
I got a call from people pretending to be the bank. They asked me to transfer all my money out of my accounts.
Told me that we had already been scammed and that he was trying to help. He knew all of my internet banking details. He knew my access codes.
Our names, address, money in the bank accounts.
He was just so confident with everything he said. He had an English accent.
It was so legitimate. It was unbelievable that it wasn't the bank.
In the 2022 financial year, our Big Four only stopped 13% of scam payments.
100% they should be doing more.
There's always more that can be done.
There should be more security.
And the banks agree. Late last year, they announced a Scam Safe Accord, listing 6 relatively simple things they could do, including name matching, where the bank checks that the recipient's name and account number match. But 8 months on, that accord sits largely unimplemented, and nothing in that plan helps a victim after they've been scammed. The one thing they won't do, reimburse.
Banks have an obligation to refund these monies.
They should do everything in their power to get it back to us.
They need to pay you back.
In the year to June 2022, our Big Four banks reimbursed just 4% of scam losses. The rationale? That the responsibility, and therefore the fault, lies with the consumer. Like this from Bendigo Bank. It's important customers take steps to protect themselves. Or this from HSBC. Never give out bank codes or passwords. The idea is that you willingly made a payment to someone and the bank has simply honoured that fact. The fact it was a payment you never should have made is, in the bank's view, not their business. It's a failure of consumer diligence rather than banking security. And when the banks do choose to cough up some cash, it's usually when under pressure.
My wife got in touch with a journalist from The Age who decided he'd write up a story. And that very same day, all the money I'd been scammed out of turned up into my account as a goodwill gesture from the bank.
A goodwill gesture. The bank's subtext is clear. This payment is an act of generosity. It's not an obligation. But should it be? In the UK, in 10 weeks, new laws will force banks to reimburse scam victims. The bill will be split between the bank transferring the funds and the bank receiving them.
That creates this financial incentive on both sides of that transaction to take action to prevent fraud.
Aussie banks aren't on board, arguing it would only encourage consumers to be careless, safe in the knowledge that they'll pay no price for their laziness and gullibility. Trouble is, that's an argument from another time, when scams were reasonably obvious, where you could reasonably say to the victim that they should have known better, that they should have taken more care. But when this happens to a customer...
I received a text from Westpac under the same text message thread where I've received all of my texts previously, asking to call them straight away.
When the scam message appears in the same thread as legitimate messages from their bank, are they really to blame? The Australian Banking Association has claimed reimbursing scam losses would simply invite more scammers, turning Australia into a honeypot. But that overlooks the problem that consumer vigilance is no longer the decisive factor here. Scammers' success is far likelier to depend on whether banks are any good at stopping scam payments from being transferred in the first place. And in Australia, it seems they aren't, because they have no incentive to be. British bank TSB began refunding scam victims more than 5 years ago. It now reimburses 97% of claims, and as a result, has seen a reduction in fraud.
I've seen firsthand the incentive it places on us to stop fraud happening.
That doesn't sound to me like a man presiding over a honeypot. But he does sound like someone who can tell his children why they should keep their money in a bank.
Well, Anna Bligh is CEO of the Australian Banking Association. Anna, we've heard so many examples of scammers infiltrating customers' existing phone message threads from banks. If people can't trust the bank's own correspondence, what hope do they have?
The stories that you've run this week have been absolutely heartbreaking.
And I hear these stories from bank customers and bank staff very frequently. Unfortunately, we've seen an explosion of scams around the world. When you think about the fact that they've been able to get into a bank's telephone thread, I think there's a question here not just for banks. It's about joining the system up. How did that happen through your telco provider? We need to look at the very beginning of a scam. It never starts in your bank. It starts on your phone, on your laptop, in an SMS, on a search engine. We need to join the whole system so that scammers, we break the scamming chain.
The scams might not start with a bank, but they certainly end with the bank when people lose money. Does it mean that people should now treat every message from a bank with suspicion?
What I'd like to think is we're not too far away from finding technology solutions to the problem of banks and other organisations being impersonated. But it is important that we all think about and be a little suspicious when we start to get these sorts of messages. Your bank will never, ever ask you to transfer funds to another account, over the phone. And so if someone rings and says, I'm from your bank's fraud department and I need you to transfer money to another account, they're a scammer. Hang up.
So that's important advice, and it deals with that particular scam, but of course scams evolve. It'll be something else that we don't know about and can't spot and all that sort of thing later, which takes us really to the question of reimbursement. And here I honestly don't understand Australia's position. In the US, 75% of scam victims at the big banks are reimbursed. In the UK, 70% are reimbursed. And that's before this new legislation, which will make it compulsory in most cases and take it much closer to 100%. In Australia, it's nowhere near that. The last report we had from up to 2022 was 4%. Why don't Australian customers deserve the same?
Well, I think you'll find that you're not comparing apples and apples. In the UK, they refer to both hacking and scams as the same thing. Here in Australia, if your bank is hacked and somehow people get into your account without you pressing anything, your bank will reimburse you. And that's counted in the UK numbers. So, in fact, not every scam victim in the UK gets reimbursed if they have acted negligently on their account. So, for example, if they give away their PIN number, then the chances of them being reimbursed is much, much lower. We as customers also have to be as careful as we can. Bad people have been trying to trick people out of money since time began. The difference today is that it's now happening globally on an industrialised scale. And that means all of us being more vigilant.
So do you accept, though, that saying that customers need to be more vigilant just doesn't make any sense anymore? I feel like what we get from the banks is be careful with your passwords, pay attention to this, pay attention to that. Do you, at the very least, just as a starting point for the conversation, accept we are way, way past that, that there is nothing that you can ask individual customers to do that's going to make the difference here?
Look, I always think there's a role for customers to do the right thing and do what they can to keep themselves safe. But there's equally a really big role for banks and others. Can I say this, though, that in Australia, in the last 12 months, we've started to see scams and the amount of money lost to scams in decline for the first time in more than a decade. We're one of the very few countries in the world that this is happening in. So our system is starting to work.
Whatever improvements we're seeing, this is still destroying people's lives. Bottom line, why shouldn't you be reimbursing these people?
Well, I think there's a real question here about if the scam came to the customer through a telco, if it came through a social media platform, if the bank warned the customer that this was a scam and they went ahead with the payment, I do think there's a legitimate question here about whether or not banks are really the ones that should be
so there are cases of
cash.
Gross negligence where the customer really, really stuffed up and they really should have known better. But that's largely yesterday's news. I'm talking in the cases we're seeing now where this would have fooled most people. We're seeing it fool people who work in the industry. Why shouldn't you, as the institution that's facilitating the payments, why shouldn't you be reimbursing them?
If the customer directs the bank to make a payment, banks are legally required to follow that direction. They can put delays in, they can try to talk to customers, they can try to prevent it. But what I think is the other thing important here is banks are not the final judge on this. If a customer has lost money through a scam where they directed the bank to make the payment, they can take a complaint to a free financial complaints authority who oversees these complaints of this nature. And if that authority thinks the bank was liable or should be liable, then they can direct the bank to make a full payment. That's not an unfair system.
It's one that requires a lot of resources if everyone is to complain. I do take your point. I thank you also for fronting up. I know it's not an easy thing for you to talk about. It's such a big issue at the moment, though. We appreciate your thoughts.
Thank you, and thank you for shining a light on it.